Welcome everybody to the inaugural episode of the Decoding CTV podcast. I am Sean Nowlin, founder and CEO of SpotlightIQ, hoping that the Decoding CTV podcast will help you all understand CTV a little bit better and in general become better marketers. And I want to have guests on here that will talk about different things and related to CTV, not related to CTV. But today I am joined by Tom Leonard, who I had met recently in the past year, but we share similar backgrounds and similar experience. So Tom, welcome to the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I feel an immense amount of pressure being the inaugural episode.
No pressure whatsoever for the tens of people that might watch us. No, I get it. But we just to clear, one thing up, we both worked for the same person, David Rodnitsky, 3Q Digital. David seems to have a kind of like a coaching tree, like an NFL, where he has a lot of people that have kind of spread off and done their own thing. But a lot of really, really good, smart marketing folks came through 3Q Digital, but we did not cross paths there. You were there after I did, but you were doing similar things. So why don't you talk a little bit about that part of your history, and then we'll talk about what you're doing today.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I was at 3Q for 7 years or so. Started doing search and social campaigns, kind of in the core client services track, like everybody does when you join an agency. And then we had built what we called the SME and the labs organization within there, where it's basically like, let's get a handful of subject matter experts and a few analysts to go run tests across the agency. David sort of did a really good job of basically articulating one of the main reasons a brand works with an agency is to enjoy the cross-agency learnings, and this was a way to really proactively do that. So I joined as our YouTube subject matter expert, having run a handful of YouTube campaigns for those couple of years, but just was really passionate about YouTube advertising in general. And it was like right after True Fraction came out. So as Google was really investing in YouTube as a DR tool for more of the DR brands, which obviously, or maybe not obviously, that's what kind of 3Q's bread and butter like client base was. So it was a really exciting time and really enjoyed that. It definitely colored a lot of kind of the rest of my sort of path, even till now, like so much around measurement and like irrational human behavior, which I'm sure I can get into a little bit, but like it was just a really interesting and exciting time for kind of YouTube advertising at large. That really butted up against kind of all things video, and then got really passionate and excited about CTV as kind of this newer sexy thing. And kind of, I guess I'll allude to some of the irrational human behavior. It really seemed easier to convince DR brands to invest in connected TV, which seems super counterintuitive, but YouTube was just so close, close to Google. Right. Like for hardcore DR brands to look in the same platform and see like the, brand search right next to like YouTube, like that was just like the brain could not compute like why YouTube bad, why brand good, despite a ton of like, really hopefully good explanation of trying to walk through that. It was too close. Google had done such a good job of like, this is fact, and kind of goes to, again, I feel like that colored so much of what I do now, because it's so much around like the myth of attribution. Right. But it made YouTube, I think, really hard. And I still think it plagues them. If you look at, we can get into it. I love what House puts out around aggregated studies, and they just put one out about YouTube, and one of the first things they did was call attention to the fact of just how big the gap is between like Meta revenue and YouTube revenue. And I still think some of those early things continue to plague why YouTube hasn't grown as much as you'd think it should as an ad platform. But I'm ranting a little bit, so I'll try to hone it in. It's okay. So then moved over as Connected TV was really growing and ran our programmatic team, which that's sort of our connection, because that was the team that you started and built at 3Q. Having not overlapped. So then I stepped in to run that team after a little while, and then did some other like innovation things within the agency, and then eventually decided to move out. And for the last 3 years have been consulting with brands directly, either in fractional performance marketing roles, or more specifically helping them really understand measurement better and how to leverage measurement as a tool to run more profitable performance marketing programs.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, obviously, fractional is a thing and has been for a while, and a lot of folks that I know from the space are doing that right now. And I will say you're definitely picking an interesting spot to work with brands on measurement, because that's always been one of the hardest things for anybody to understand. It's like taking, people that know me know that I started in this whole career at Progressive Insurance, so I had the benefit of humongous budgets, but also great data. But I took it for granted that, I was on the display advertising team before really programmatic became a thing. And we had all this great data proving out the value of what we're doing. I mean, Progressive to this day is a leader in the space, and we just knew it worked because the data told us it would work. But then I left, to go work at 3Q Digital. But the toughest thing was that data did not exist anywhere else. Understanding the actual performance of anything was always really difficult. And that was really early. That was still really early in like the multi-touch attribution game. Progressive just had their own model that worked. And so leaving there is always the harder nut to crack from display, from video, proving out the value. The paid search and paid social seemed to make, it's always easy because of attribution. You're doing the fractional thing now. And when we first met the thing that really struck me was how you talked about attribution and incrementality. I want to, and you just posted, I think it was either today or yesterday, just another post about working with a client, and after a few weeks of testing, showing things that are working, not working. But I was struck by what you said about didn't find anything. It was not. It was like most, and somebody commented in your post that most tests fail. And I think that's important to understand is that you're trying to, have to prove something is working. You can prove that it's not working. But let's take a step back and talk a little bit about attribution. I think most people watching this came to this game understanding last touch attribution, last click attribution a lot. But we all know that can be inherently flawed. So tell me a little bit why does attribution suck?
I like the way that you phrase it up. But the phrase that I use a lot and I think answers that question is because attribution tells you if something happened, but it doesn't tell you if it mattered. And I think and I use that phrase over and over again because I try to drive that point home. But so many people spend a lot of time trying to get the perfect attribution model. And I think that's just, it's a wasted time and effort because you don't actually care that much about did something occur? You really are trying to answer, did something matter? And did it actually change behavior? And now some of the pushback that I get from folks, and I think is right and true, is the smaller the brand, the less you probably have to worry about that compared to larger brands where you really need to worry about that. But the idea of attribution is did an ad, get in front of somebody before they purchased. And we leap to the assumption that meant that ad was needed. Whereas the difference between attribution and incrementality is not comparing what happened compared to nothing. That's what attribution is comparing. It's comparing what happened versus what would have happened in the absence of that ad. And for a marketer, that's the delta that you should care about because that's all your ad dollars are driving is the above and beyond what was going to happen otherwise.
Right. Because if it's all going to happen anyway, what's the point? But marketing does work. It just matters of what's your mix. What do you need to do? I definitely have talked recently to a lot of folks in the paid social space and a lot of DTC brands that are very, very much heavy into Meta. Still really works for them as a channel, either Instagram or Facebook. And they're looking at trying something else, but they're coming at it from not an attribution standpoint because they know that, if you're looking at it purely from an attribution standpoint, it's not going to necessarily look good in other places because everything is coming through Meta right now. So anyway, but I want to focus a little bit on why people are still doing it. And I know you mentioned for smaller brands, maybe it doesn't matter as much, but I think that wasting dollars is important even for small brands. But why do you think it's still, to this day, 2025, everybody seems to still easily fall into the last touch attribution trap?
Because it's easy.
Easy. Yeah.
People like easy things. I mean, I really do think it's as simple as I just think it's that easy. It's that clear and obvious. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some more nuance to it because, it's easy and the standard because Google has made it that way. Mm-hmm. And I do think there's a little bit of, I don't know what the right phrasing is, but it's not been discouraged. And I've been talking so much recently about, so I'll try not to get on the rabbit hole, but I do think a lot of that has plagued YouTube's growth, which I alluded to a little earlier, because it's sort of a classic innovator's dilemma of Google would be shooting themselves in the foot. You mentioned a LinkedIn post and I'm writing one right now because I'm so caught up in this idea that YouTube would be way bigger if Google didn't have search because they don't want you to run incrementality tests. When I think there's some stat 50% of spend or 50% of attributed conversions in all of Google ads is branded keywords. They don't want to lose that.
Right.
And anytime you run, not anytime, but most times you run, a brand search incrementality test, what do you find? Like that it's not all that incremental and probably not even worth the money. But again, that's a huge part of Google's business. So like they don't want to put, consumer facing conversion lift study tools like Facebook does kind of into everybody's hands for everybody to learn that they don't actually need to be bidding on their brand terms. And so I don't even know how I got down this rabbit hole, but I think that's a really important point because like we've gotten used to that idea. And so people apply that sort of last click to other channels,
Right.
where it maybe doesn't make any sense, or at least doesn't tell you the whole picture. But I think in a word, it happens because it's easy.
Yeah.
And I do think now it's been so much time of doing that I do think that's muscle memory for a lot of people and an expectation for a lot of finance teams, which I think then sort of reinforces the problem. Like if a performance marketer has always given a finance team, like, here's how successful my program is, therefore I am, like, look at these sort of reporting, dashboards that show all the traffic that came through blended performance marketing. And like, look how much of a portion of revenue that is, like, to all of a sudden go back and say, actually 60% of that was going to happen anyways. I'm,
Right.
40% or 60% as important as, you thought I was. Like, people just don't want to do that. And I do think that's part of the problem. And a little bit of how we got here. I often talk to about like the idea of like, 50% of advertising is wasted. I just don't know what half, right? Like how everybody talks about, but like when performance marketers were like, look at me, I'm the 50% that works, like, and the brand team is the one wasting it all. I think there's like, I say that, tongue in cheek, but I think there's actually a lot of truth to that. Like, as you think about like the brand versus performance divide, and even some of the challenges that like programmatic teams face in a DR sort of world, or a DR agency, it's like, prove it to me and prove it to me in the way that I want it to be proven to me via last click, like I do with search. And so I think all those things sort of compound, and I don't think it's necessarily a rational sort of argument, but again, I don't think people are always rational.
No, people are definitely not always rational. And I love talk about DR and programmatic. The way I used to talk about it a lot back in the day, that display was DR, delayed response, but it's actually how to prove that. That's what was hard back then. Really, all you had were the walled gardens that existed at that moment, Google being one of them. You had Google Analytics, and then you did have some, multi-touch attribution vendors that were out there. Then all got caught. All of them got purchased by the big players. So they all disappeared for a while. I wonder why. But then there was multi-touch attribution models. They're all platforms that came and gone, that had come and gone. You had Google Analytics has different models you can look at. And then all of a sudden, I don't know how many years ago, MMM studies started being discussed a bit more. That used to be the world of the big advertisers. But what's been your experience with kind of moving with an advertiser moving from just your siloed attribution or even multi-touch if you had to MMM studies? What is your experience with that?
Yeah, it's so funny because the whole thing is like what's old is new again. Like it used, like, because I think MMM and incrementality testing for prospecting mostly done through geo holdouts. Like those are like the two best ways to do it. But those are like the old school ways to do it too. We sort of had this like period of time, right, where like you could actually get away and use some MTA sort of tools, but like all the signals that make those things useful, like so much of that has gone away and is going to continue to go. Like, I don't think the toothpaste is going back in the tube with respect to like one-to-one deterministic user level, like targeting and tracking.
Right.
And so I think it's crazy to think that like, we're ever going to go back to that world. And so I think it makes sense that before those things existed, what tools did we use that didn't rely on any, user level deterministic one-to-one level tracking? It's media mix modeling and geo experiments. So it's fun to see like that's what like the most modern brands are using. And I mean, the main value for both modeling and geo experiments is to answer the question, experiments through like causal studies and modeling through correlation is like, what is your kind of resilient base of customers? What are the ones that don't need advertising? And that's really like what you're trying to figure out. So the first like incrementality test most brands should run is like all of your media, like figure out, okay, what in the absence of all of this would we be driving? And same with a model, like the most important first place to look for is like, what is the base or intercept value? Like outside of media, what was going to kind of be driven without marketing? Because again, that's like the whole
Right.
shooting matches, knowing like what is marketing actually driving. So yeah, I think brands need to be leveraging those things. It also evens the playing field for channels that don't drive a lot of clicks, because still so much of, if you're in the kind of the MTA world, it's basically all just relying on click data. And so the channels that don't drive a click, nobody clicks on display ads. Nobody clicks on, video ads for the most part. That's not entirely fair if it's in social platforms. But like the way that I always articulate, even YouTube versus Facebook, like people go on Facebook to get off of Facebook. People go to YouTube to stay on YouTube. Like therefore the YouTube's going to have a lot less click data than something like Facebook. But all of these tools all these platforms that don't have a lot of click data are also never going to like show well in MTA. But again, if you can remove the need for a click in the way that you do with incrementality testing or modeling, it levels the playing field a lot. So you can actually understand like what is each channel doing, which is the goal of attribution, but it fails in it.
So moving to talk about incrementality here, like, so over the past couple years with a client that I worked with at my last job, we worked with Rockerbox. The first push there was moving the client from their homegrown, which was originally click-based attribution model. They wanted to incorporate impression level data, right? That was something they were spending a lot of money on, in video especially, and they wanted to understand it more. And I was, as a programmatic person solely at the time, I was like, oh, let's use this because I know that programmatic can look better in these models. But what was interesting over the past few years is you could see Rockerbox, which obviously we all know they are now going to be acquired by Double Verify. So obviously they were doing something right over the past few years, but they started introducing MMM as part of their solution. And then incrementality also, I think, was a part of their solution. So you saw these platforms realizing they needed to start really going down the incrementality path because they're being asked about it, because other platforms were definitely pushing back on that idea. You mentioned Google having a hard time with that. But Facebook is definitely one I think has led that a little bit more than others when it comes to the walled gardens. They're the ones that are really pushing back on anything incrementality wise. But again, it's a big thing now, and that's really what you're focusing on. So to talk a little bit about incrementality, for a seasoned marketer might be still kind of stuck in the last touch model, attribution model game. Talk a little bit about that and why it works to help prove out value of your marketing dollars.
Yeah, I mean, at its core, there's a handful of. So I guess like we defined it a little bit, but like it's helpful to like start from the super simple definition of incrementality to like then all the different steps along to like how you actually get insights and take action and drive value from that. Like if the goal is, which it should be, to understand the not compared to nothing, but compared to what would have happened without ads, how much revenue conversions did ads drive. There's basically a few ways to get the counterfactual, to get the what if sort of line or part of that equation. The most common way to do it is with like geo holdouts. So most common in prospecting. So when you don't know the customers, the kind of best way to create a test and control cell is geographically. So most people, whether you call it a match market test or using synthetic controls, which is kind of like the newer kind of way to do it. Your goal is to say, these are markets, because we can always, for the most part, buy or exclude markets at the DMA, state, whatever level within any ad platform. So like that's sort of the goal, right? You would know way more about, in programmatic, everybody used to run PSA tests, right?
Yeah.
And like both technologically got challenging and also the opportunity cost if you're still buying this, Smokey the Bear ad.
10%.
Whereas, right. Whereas, in geo holdouts, you don't have to do that, which is great. Sure, there's some opportunity cost in not running those ads if they're super effective, but that point aside, it's a great way to run those tests. In retention, it's really great because you actually know who you're trying to serve ads to. So imagine I always use the scenario of like email marketing. I've got all my customers. I've got customer IDs that end in even versus odd. I'm going to send the email to everybody that, has an even customer ID, not send it to odd ones so that I can compare those two groups, agnostic of, did anybody, because people will convert in the group that I didn't send the coupon to or send the email to, but I don't want to compare the people that I sent it to, how many converted. I want to know of those people, how many converted over and above how many we're going to convert anyways, a la the people that did not receive that ad. So the whole point of incrementality is to have, or the whole structure is a group that gets the ads and a group that doesn't. And that's important to mention because depending on where you're running, or even if it's prospecting, retargeting, the way that you run an incrementality test will change a bit. And you talked about Facebook. That's a good example where like when the walled gardens completely own the auction, they can do a lot of that testing for you. Now, that begs some of the questions around grading on homework, which, certainly is a real thing. But to your point, like, Facebook, I'm generally more bullish on Facebook than Google right now. And I tend to like stack rank my bullishness on a platform based on how open they are to third-party incrementality testing, or even incrementality testing at large. And I admit I probably live in a bit of a bubble and think everybody is like, losing sleep over how incremental like each channel is. The reality is I think the more people that I talk to, and the fact that like every 4 years I go in this panic attack of like, oh my gosh, the whole thing's a bubble. Like, why, everything's going to crumble because people are relying on last electric. That obviously hasn't really happened. But I do feel like there's just more inertia coming right now around skepticism, but every couple of years there's another scandal, whether it's like Honey recently or some of these other, like there's always something, when Uber turned off all their advertising and nothing happened, or like back in the day, eBay not buying brand terms. Like every 5-10 years, there's something that you think is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, but it never seems to. Last click is pretty resilient. But something like Meta, where you can run a kind of in-platform conversion lift study, like that's a really great place for brands to start. And if you can understand the concept of incrementality over and above what would have happened otherwise, Facebook, because they own the auction, they can say, hey, we're going to give you a 10% holdout. Those people are going to see the next highest bidder in the auction, but we're still going to track those people and see what they do over time. They'll normalize that up to be able to actually compare absolute numbers to the numbers that you get attributed wise. They'll be able to then say you got this many attributed conversions, but you got this many conversions above what was going to happen, if you didn't run ads, by comparing it to the group that you did not run ads to, but you still tracked, which maybe that's hard to follow. So I could probably explain that better. But the idea of now as an advertiser, your whole goal is to try to compare what is the attribution saying versus what is incrementality saying, so that you can normalize what attribution is saying and sort of bring that up or down depending on what you learn through an incrementality test. Because oftentimes attribution is going to be like overstating. That's not always the case, but take branded search, for example. Like it's always going to overstate what's really, causal and being driven by that. So if you run an incrementality test and you're like, hey, really, I only drove 100 conversions. Attribution is saying 1,000 conversions. You know that you need to divide, or do a 10% multiplier on what the attribution is saying. And that's the whole game with incrementality is figuring out how do I need to modify what the platforms are reporting to make that what is actually happening.
And that's the way that you just described that too is literally like back in the day, like 12 years ago, that's how we got to, results. The incrementality. And before it was really determined or called that, we would say what's coming out of double, what we'll call it, what it was back then, but, DART, double click for advertisers, CFA. We would take what it was saying, it was view through credit, and we would multiply it, and that would be what we would optimize against, and it worked. But that was a long time ago also. So it's interesting that the way you put it is exactly how we were doing it. It was just referred to as something different.
Yeah, it's so funny because like we've always had skepticism around view through. And so like it's always been, but what's funny about that is like you would always do, we're going to give a haircut for whatever percent to view through, but not to click through, because click through is always seen as like, that's perfect. Let's leave that the way it is. But like, and brand search is another good example where like most marketers inherently know, hey, that's not the full story looking at the attributed number for brand. Retargeting is another good example, right? Like you inherently know retargeting, like you probably need to give a haircut to. But what I'm the most fascinated with is that doesn't easily translate to all other ad channels. And I think it really has to. And there's no reason you shouldn't hold all the ad platforms or all the different channels and tactics to the same accord, especially as more get blended, like different dynamic ad units. So like Performance Max, on the Google side, Advantage Plus Shopping on the Facebook side, these tools that blend essentially prospecting and retargeting together. If those inherently are going to have wildly different incrementality factors and you don't know how much is getting spent in both, that's a real problem. And that's, those things exist outside of the walled gardens here, Google and Facebook, right? Like that's one of the risks or the challenges with AppLovin, with Mountain, which I know you'll probably want to talk about, like any of these like black box blended sort of things. Incrementality becomes so important because otherwise you literally have no idea if and by how much these tools, these tactics are actually adding to your business.
Right. So I guess the one thing I want to ask you is if you're because you mentioned in the post today you're working with an SMB, or I think you could just say an SMB. If I'm an SMB advertiser, B2C, and I want to get a little bit more sophisticated with incrementality, like how should I approach it, and like what are the kind of next steps I would need to do to start building this into what we're doing every single day?
Yeah. So the answer is it sort of depends, which I know is like not a fun answer.
That's okay.
But like you first have to like ask the question or like stress test, like, do you need to care about it?
Okay.
Because I do think like that's an important piece. I think I tend to work with larger companies where they for sure need to worry about this because there's such a big base of existing customers. But for depending on the size of the brand, you could put like arbitrary revenue cutoffs or whatever. But like the smaller the brand, theoretically, the least you have, like the less you have to worry about it, because you should be able to feel if something's not incremental. Because ideally, especially in like a direct to consumer only, the P&L should basically tell you, is something incremental or not. Because if you are looking at a blended CAC or MER number and you decide, hey, this month I'm going to double my ad spend because things seem really great, and you see no gain in your top line, but you double your spend, was not the spend that you added is not incremental, or put another way, is just not valuable. It's not actually doing anything for you. Now, if your platform reported numbers say you scaled perfectly linearly, your CPA is the same and you doubled spend, then that would indicate your spend is not incremental at all relative to what attribution is saying. The smaller the business, the more you're going to directly feel whether something is valuable or incremental.
Right.
And so you don't always have to worry about running incrementality tests and things like that. Now there's some like very like easy use cases there. The one that I think you're referring to is like this, if you've got a small finite budget and you decide, hey, I'm going to cut from where I'm seeing the worst attributed numbers or the worst attributed ROAS or CPA, and just double down on the things that are working well in attribution. Like those are likely to be the things that are the least incremental. Like if you're, so branded search, retargeting, like two really good examples. Like that's not a great place to spend all of your money if you have a very limited, resource budget, because you're probably just going to be spending that money on conversions that were going to happen anyways. And so that's a great example of like, all we know is that we should spend in these things that are showing these great numbers. Is that really the case? Like turn it off or split the country in half, do like a poor man's match market test, like run a very simple, it doesn't have to be that scientific. You could turn it all the way off because again, at the small end of things, you should feel it. So if you turn off all the ads and nothing happens, again, in the same way as if you double it, like you're going to know if something is generally incremental or actually additive to top line. So on the smaller end, if you need it at all, you can sort of feel it out. You're close enough to the numbers, especially if you're not in sort of an omni-channel view. But then on the higher end, like if you're, spending a ton of money in ads, if you're, again, numbers are sort of arbitrary, but if you're a, 9-figure, maybe, I don't know if you're doing 100, I don't know. The numbers are sort of arbitrary, I think. But like if you have real skepticism, on your 10 different Facebook tactics or whatever, like Facebook's conversion lift study, I think is a really great tool to just sort of get a gut check. Here's what Facebook's reporting. Here's, we tend to take that as gospel because that's our only sort of view. I wonder if that's accurate or not. So understanding, can I just do it with all of my Facebook? Like, let's get a sense of, for all Facebook, how close is the incremental number to what Facebook is reporting? I think even better, are there portions of your Facebook account that you may be skeptical of? So like, hey, we run a lot of retargeting because it's really hard to shift dollars out of there because the attributed numbers look great. And again, that's kind of what we use to judge success. I want to do a gut check of the incrementality of retargeting versus the incrementality of Facebook, because what you might find is that, even though the retargeting number is, that the ROAS is 10 times better than prospecting, when you actually run incrementality tests for both, it turns out that prospecting is actually twice as valuable as retargeting. And that would dramatically shift how you think about budgeting, even if you're inherently doing some of the haircutting of retargeting, because in your heart of hearts, like it's not going to be as valuable as prospecting. So there's free tools, whether it's gut feel or just using Facebook's conversion lift study tool. It's heavily invested in Facebook to get started. And because so much of it will depend on like, how willing are you to take action based off of the insights that you gather from either the gut feel tests or even something like Facebook. Like I always tell people, before you go sign up for a SaaS vendor, like actually gut check and make sure that you're actually going to change behavior based off the insights that you get from these tools. Because the worst thing that you can do is go spend a couple $100,000 on a tool only to never actually change behavior. And the only way you derive value from one of those tools or any insight is by changing behavior. Like otherwise it just is a really expensive data point or insight that you put in a slide once and forget.
Stakeholder buy-in or just overall philosophy of how to handle things.
And so you can get those reps in by doing the non-super scientific tests or the kind of low effort tests. And I always encourage people to do that.
So I think that's a good point, because I think a lot of times, well, there, on one hand, you have the classic analysis paralysis. You have too much data. You don't even know what to do with it all. But in reality, sometimes it's just being able to know when you're supposed to ask questions or if you need to, but then being willing to like take those steps. I think a lot of people are just stuck in what they know, and they might think things look cool or sound cool. Oh, incrementality sounds cool, but you know, to your point, like you have to really kind of be ready to act on those results.
Yeah, and know exactly what they mean. Because you just reminded me of a point, like way back, like when Google would run like conversion lift studies, like for larger clients that were running a lot on YouTube. Like I'll never forget getting like slide decks back that basically said like, congratulations, you drove a 4% lift, which is just not helpful at all. But people would use that and say like, oh, look, we drove a lift. But like driving a lift is not the goal. You need to quantify 4% for, Fortune 500 company. That's massive. 4% for like super upstart D2C, like doesn't matter at all. If you spend, if you spent $500,000 on these ads that drove 4% for one advertiser, that's amazing. For one advertiser, oh my gosh, we're going to like lose the company. And so like you have to contextualize and know like what data points are we actually trying to get out of this? And how do we translate those into, there's only a few decisions, right? That you can make with any sort of data point, like around increment. It's like, I should spend more, I should spend less, I should stop spending. Like those are, or like keep things perfectly as is. Like there's not that many. You could build the decision tree ahead of time and like, okay, we're going to make one of those 4 decisions because there's literally no other decision you can make. I need the data. Like I already should know if it's in this realm, I'm going to do this. If it's in this realm, I'm going to do this. Like it makes the like analysis paralysis, I think, go away ahead of time. We're going to take an action based off of this. It just depends on what this number comes back with. But you have to know like what number am I actually looking for, because it's not some in context number like a lift percentage.
For sure. Yeah. It's definitely interesting, over the last couple of years.
You struck a nerve.
Hey, listen, I worked with Google back in the progressive days. And I watched how a lot of advertisers would just forget for a second what those reports would say. You'd have a lot of advertisers that had the ability to get some data, get some support, understand things. Now it's like you're on your own, even if you're a decently sized advertiser trying to understand, should I or should I not be? But the goal there is really to get spend. I see it all the time on LinkedIn, everybody talking about their Google reps. We could see if we could help you do this, and we're your new Google rep, and you could spend more and get this, but it's just a sales role at that point. It's just trying to get more spend, and just the whole idea of trying to understand if something's working or not, I feel like that's ancient at this point. But yeah, I hear you for sure. It's been beating up on Google has actually been one of my favorite things over the years, and a lot of respect to a lot of people that have worked there, still work there. But we all know that's difficult. There are millions of advertisers out there that are trying to win any given day. But yeah, so to move things a little forward here, I wanted to talk a little bit about connected TV. I'm in it every single day. It's part of my programmatic background. You came to it in a little bit of a different experience level, but their connected TV has definitely grown off the idea of performance television. And I think that can be, you mentioned, depending on, how much money you're actually spending, should they care about incrementality? How much, work should you put towards figuring it out? I think that, performance TV can be fine for some folks, but I think, if you really do come at it, this is television. This is brand awareness at its core. And if you can get measurement, or you can understand how things are transacting, and you can do studies, you can try to prove out more bottom of the funnel approach. But talk to me a little bit about your experience with connected TV, and then fitting into your idea today of incrementality and how important that is.
Yeah. So my experience slash background in connected TV is mostly for DR oriented advertisers, I'll call them, helping using CTV as a tool to move up funnel, as much as you may hate the idea of funnel. But like basically, if there's two sides, it's demand capture and demand creation.
Mm-hmm.
You have to create demand in addition to just capturing it. And so for direct to consumer or, hardcore DR advertisers, there's a general understanding that you have to create demand as well. And my background and experience with CTV is using CTV as a tool for exactly that. And again, I won't belabor this point, but there is something really interesting about the like human psychology of connected TV being this like both kind of sexy newer thing.
Yep.
As well as you cannot click on it, which I think helps so much in getting, the general understanding of you have to measure it differently than the way you measure Facebook, even YouTube, which I think is actually a really good thing and is part of the reason why I think CTV has, continues to grow as much as it does versus I still think brands are more likely, maybe this is wrong. I'd love to see like a survey around this. I think brands are more likely to run connected TV than like a reach and frequency or like upper funnel campaign in Facebook for the same reason I think I mentioned at the start. Brands I think historically have struggled with YouTube just for how close it sits to Google compared to connected TV is so far removed and it's sexy and a little bit easier to understand. So I definitely have felt that in even at the agency side, like getting brands bought in on a demand creation channel. Connected TV, I think, is an easier sell through.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's definitely a better conversation in general with clients than talking about programmatic, which is, I still, I tell everybody what I do today. It's easier. It's an easier conversation. It's TV. It sounds like TV, right?
But I'm also like extremely optimistic about programmatic in general, like as we go forward, because I do think, again, I probably live in a bubble, but like, I do feel like there's this resistance against attribution and against black box. And like programmatic at its core is like the opposite of black box. It's like, true, like what programmatic is meant to be is like almost too much data. And I think like it was too much data to where that's kind of what led to some of the black box versions of programmatic. And even with it, like, how can we make it so simple? Just give us a credit card and a ROAS target.
Right.
But like there needs to be something in between or smart people layered on top of the former of too much data synthesized to like what actually matters and how do you extract value from that.
That's yes. And I think it's the smart people on top. Connected TV, as what you mentioned, the big sexy thing right now, is definitely being driven by smaller advertisers. And what I mentioned before we started recording, I want to talk a little bit about this, is the Mountain, the CTV platform filed its S1. But what struck me in there was the number of the average size of their client. Average size is $8 million a year in annual revenue. And to me, and when I think about TV and upper funnel and brand awareness and demand generation, that just seems so small to me. So I'm realizing that the people in the space that are moving here are the smaller advertisers, are the SMBs. But that was something that struck me. And I know you had something else too about that, but that was $8 million annual revenue and that's not spend. Because I had this conversation in the office the other day when I was talking about it. They're like, wait, $8 million a year in advertising spend? Like, no, $8 million annual revenue, which is squarely in the SMB space. So, but that was smaller advertisers seem to be driving the popularity of this channel. And that's the one thing that struck me from that filing.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it too stems from the kind of zeitgeist around diversification away from Facebook, or even Facebook and Google. That like, and I think that's sort of been their Mountain's pitch, and I think there's a lot of issues with it. Of like, again, give me the credit card number and a ROAS target. Like people want the sort of easy on ramp, especially smaller advertisers that just take it and run with it. Versus I want to actually understand and like prove out if this is really valuable or not. Mm-hmm. Like that's sort of the if you think of that size brand, if I'm running Facebook and Google, but I sort of get this feeling or I'm hearing from others, or I have my own like desire to diversify in case there's some, iOS apocalypse or whatever again, that like if I'm overly reliant on one platform, like just general, wisdom and diversification, that like that might be the place to go. So I think you probably see a lot of that with them in particular. But I think you're right in general with the ecosystem, like programmatic, connected TV in particular, like I think does appeal to a lot of, and it should, it's super exciting. I think that is what's sexy, is like now I can be on the big screen as the volume and hours watched of connected TV is growing so rapidly. Like it's awesome, I think, for all parties, and like to continue to make that sort of TV free, it needs to be reliant on advertising. And so like it's just shifting from linear. But like, so it's a growing space and more accessible. Like, I think it's a no-brainer and makes a ton of sense why so many smaller brands are now have the accessibility. And I think there's rightful excitement for brands at all levels to like finally be able to run TV ads.
Right. I mean, last summer I was at a restaurant with my wife. We were sitting at the bar eating dinner, and I looked up at the TV, and it was a commercial for a local plumber, and it was branded Vibe.co, which is one of the platforms you can use to get on to CTV. I was kind of struck by the fact that it was still branded by the platform, which I mean, imagine watching a video for whatever on Facebook or something like that, and just the ad itself was branded as Meta. It was very weird to me. But initially I was struck by this plumber is obviously doing connected television, and I'm probably not spending a ton of money, but I think it definitely was interesting to me. There are different ways to get on TV now. And I think that is great, but you have to be careful about it too, because all these smaller advertisers that are spending money on these platforms, it's an expensive channel. And I think that for me, when you talked about, hey, like, if you are not a super sophisticated big spender, or how much do you care, how much should you care or not care about, proving something out, CTV is by far, I mean, from CPM perspective, the most expensive channel out there. Even if you're spending $5,000 a month on CTV, I think that you should care about that. Are you making sure that you're actually hitting your target audience and not just getting in front of wherever? So there's different parts of it, but that's where I'm at with it. Is like, even if you're not spending a ton of money on it, you should figure out a way you're getting the most out of your working media dollars. But again, that was just a conversation we had internally about how much people should care, and do they care? Should we talk about this more? So I mean, I'll put that to you. Should advertisers, the $8 million a year annual revenue, clients or advertisers, should they care about understanding more about this?
100%. And that's sort of what I don't like about the brand versus, nobody likes the brand versus performance divide. But I think like the biggest challenge is like every dollar that you spend in advertising is supposed to accomplish a goal. And frankly, it's supposed to accomplish the same goal. It's supposed to drive revenue. Now there's different ways to kind of dissect that into what are the, leading indicators or micro conversions that we expect that on the, are going to lead to the ultimate revenue, even if that takes place later down. But so I always tell like, you've got to care a lot, but you also have to be reasonable about like what you can measure, especially in a short time horizon. And just be really clear up front about like, what is that you're trying to drive? And also like, can you validate that through not just the lens of the person that you are kind of buying that media through, right? To go back to like the grading the own homework point, like you should know what you're trying to accomplish in a couple different ways to understand if that's happening or not. So like when we were talking about the, lower kind of size brand kind of feeling something, like that applies to CTV as well. You just might not feel the the revenue or the orders or whatever in the same immediacy as you will if you turn off branded search or something right at that point of order. And so you have to be realistic about that. And so you've got to figure out like, and I'm sure you have this conversation all the time, like you've got to find what is the right thing or the most appropriate thing to measure, whether that's, site traffic. CTV is great because you don't have to worry about ruining site traffic as a KPI, for instance, whereas like, if somebody's running native and you run like the, here's the 5 things your cardiologist doesn't want you to know, like that's going to drive a lot of site traffic, but it's not going to be valuable site traffic. So like connected TV, do you see a lift in site traffic? Do you see a lift in branded search? Do you see any number of things that you could be measuring that is most likely to actually take place in a short period of time when you're trying to assess it versus, is this driving revenue that may take some time if people are further away from that point of purchase compared to something that's demand capture like search.
I think that is very important, and that is something that we talk about is understanding the impact of other channels, understand this impact on site traffic. It doesn't have to just be about what is the CPA or ROAS you're seeing within the platform that you're choosing to run on.
Totally.
But if you're going to go use a platform and you're just going to consider it to be another Facebook, and you're just going to like look at the CPA, you're really missing the forest for the trees because of how it's, like we said, connected TV, brand awareness channel, like it's on the living room screen or even on your phone or whatever. You're paying attention, you're not clicking, but it's doing something. But you have to be ready to look at those other signals.
Well, it's a huge risk to just go in and say, like, I only want to drive a ROAS of this or a CPA of this, especially if it's blending retargeting and prospecting together, which all these black box solutions do, right?
Yes.
Like it's incredibly easy to hit whatever ROAS target you want. You're just going to dial up the ratio of, retargeting to prospecting or in search, brand versus non-brand. Like you can get any ROAS or CPA you want in a blended sort of environment like that, just by playing with the ratios of prospecting versus retargeting, which again, if that's what, if that's how the kind of black box solutions are operating, like you really you'd rather not give them a ROAS target. You'd rather say, I want to drive new visits to my website, as an example. Like that would be a much more because then they'd be shifting more toward prospecting, which is ultimately like when people go to a channel like connected TV, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get incremental new customers, incremental reach, incremental, website visits. You're trying to get stuff that you're not getting from your current media mix. That's why people go to connected TV in the first place.
That's a really great point. I just talked to someone the other day in paid social who the brand is looking to get into connected TV. And the reason why the way that they break it down in Facebook was by age groupings. And they noticed that a certain age group that was a little skewed, a little older, was one of the smallest parts of their overall sales there, or success there, I should say. But they know that this age group was very important to the product and would buy their product. So connected TV, a space that by very nature, TV skewed older, although cord cutters skews that younger, but there's something to be said about that. And that is a great point about understanding why you're going there. And CTV can fill that gap for you if you're thinking about it the right way.
Yeah.
Cool.
But to your point, I think like the reason that that's so important is because it is so expensive, right? That like you've got to be, doubly or probably quadruply, if that's a word, right? If the CPM is so much more expensive, then it's even more important that you are measuring appropriately and holding that to account.
And the other way too, I think is that be leery of the super cheap CPMs, because if you're buying CTV and it's really, really cheap, well, first of all, where is it coming from? Is it a crap fast platform, or is it just really, really remnant inventory that you're getting that is not premium anymore? So you have to peel that. I'm not saying everything's got to be $30, but I'm saying that you have to be careful with too cheap, because does that really make sense that you're paying the same CPM as you are for OLV or online video impression? I don't know. That maybe it is, but it doesn't make any sense to me.
But it's a great point to where, like, when you have the right measurement in place, a lot of that stuff doesn't actually matter. Like those are great proxies for what is likely to drive the right outcome and the desired outcome, because I'm 100% with you. Like there's really easy telltale signs of like, that's just you're not buying what you think you're buying.
Right.
But there is a world where, like, if you have the right measurement framework, that maybe there is an opportunity. The inventory is more garbage, but if it's a quarter of the price, is it more than a quarter as effective, right? There is that arbitrage of like, it's not, there's a $10 CPM and a $30 CPM. The $10 is not as effective, but on a net basis, depending on how effective it is, it's not 3 times less effective. So there is an interesting, if you nail the measurement side, you can go find those sort of opportunities. But more often than not, that's the niche or the nuance. More often than not, it's like, okay, the CPM is so low, clearly you have no idea what you're buying. Yeah. Let's look into this a little bit.
That's for sure. Unless it's actually a linear that's translated from spot price to CPM. Yeah, it's pretty cheap. But that being said, I think we've talked for a while about incrementality and measurements, and this has been a very, very great conversation with absolutely no pauses, which is a first for me. Recording one of these things, we made it all the way through. But if I am a SMB to mid-market sized advertiser, what's your words of wisdom to me navigating the space of incrementality? What's your parting shot? What's the one thing I should remember from all this?
think just be curious and a little bit skeptical, because I think that's part of the reason why attribution and like even last click has prevailed for so long is there's almost a little bit of like a lack of skepticism or curiosity. And I do hope that the tides are turning there a little bit. But I'd say coupled with those two things is it's not that hard, sort of gut check or kind of get a quick proof point on incrementality. It's like turn it all off. And depending on the size of the brand, that's going to be more or less scary, but there are more or less crazy ways to do that. But I think the curiosity and the skepticism should lead to, let me take a first sort of gut, type test to sort of validate or kind of prove out your skepticism or what you're actually getting reported to. So curiosity, skepticism, and take action.
I mean, I think to me, take action, 100% obvious, but I think your skepticism, I think having skepticism of what you're looking at, how much you've been doing this for years, you're spending it on one platform, it's been growing great, have some, have skepticism. It's good, it's healthy to have skepticism. And I think honestly, starting off at Progressive Insurance, that gave me a lot of skepticism, probably too much at sometimes, but I think that's super important, and is to have some healthy skepticism.
When it leads to confidence, because like the skepticism puts you on a path toward, I want to prove this out, which then you prove it out. And if it still is proving out, that just increases your confidence that like put the stake in the ground, we should be spending here, and you may uncover areas we should not be spending here. Let's reallocate those dollars. And I think it's a really healthy place for a brand to be.
Awesome. Well, Tom Leonard, thank you so much for joining me today on this inaugural Decoding CTV podcast. So we'll see how this goes, but hopefully we'll do more of these, and maybe one day, in the future, we'll come back and see how the incrementality game rolled out over the next year or two. And, is it been a big success for these smaller advertisers growing into bigger advertisers? And, if CTV was a part of that or not. So if it's a bright, shiny object for now, will it be that way next year? We'll find out.
Yeah. Appreciate you having me on. I love this sort of conversation. So
awesome. Yeah, it was a great conversation. Thanks, Tom. All right.